Previously, we looked at the blood-forming tissues and organs, and we understood the concept right from gestation or pregnancy. And we said that when the male and the female gametes unite, we form the zygote. And this zygote is an embodiment of stem cells. And these stem cells have the ability or the potential of giving rise to all the cells of our body, including the placenta and then the umbilical cord. This zygote stage is actually a stage where no hematopoiesis occur. And so this zygote actually undergoes further cell divisions to form what is called the embryo. It is the embryonic stage that is where blood cell production begins. And this actually happens in the first 2 months of gestation. And there is a structure found in the embryo known as the yolk sac. And we understood that the walls of the yolk sac is enriched with stem cells. We call them hematopoietic stem cells. So hematopoietic stem cells are around the walls of the yolk sac. And once there are stem cells in the walls of the yolk sac, it implies that these stem cells will have a potential. And the potential carrying these stem cells is called the pluripotent stem cell. So pluri means many. So the stem cells that are found in the embryo are described as pluripotent stem cells. Now, so within the embryo, this is where hematopoiesis occur. And hematopoiesis in the embryo is called embryonic hematopoiesis. And because the hematopoiesis is actually happening in the yolk sac of the embryo, we can call it the yolk sac hematopoiesis. The embryo actually has 3 layers, and these layers include the ectoderm, which is the outside layer. We have the mesoderm, which is the middle layer, and we have the endoderm, which refers to the inside layer. Now, the yolk sac where hematopoiesis is occurring is actually found in the middle layer. And for this reason, this hematopoiesis is so named after the middle layer of the embryo, and that becomes meso, meaning middle. So mesoblastic hemopoiesis. So we have the mesoblastic hemopoiesis. And this is actually happens within the first 2 months of gestation. So the first 2 months of gestation or pregnancy. So the first 2 months of gestation or pregnancy. Then from the embryo, we know that just as there was development from the zygote to the embryonic stage, likewise the embryo will undergo further development. And when this embryo undergoes further development, we form what is called the fetus. And the fetus will imply that we are in the fetal stage. And technically, this happens, or the fetal hematopoiesis happen within the 3rd to the 5th month of gestation. At the fetal stage, important organs like the liver, so the liver begins to appear. So the liver begins to appear. It happens to be the first hematopoietic organ to appear in the fetal stage, and later the spleen comes in to contribute to the production of blood cells. Because much of the blood cells are coming from the liver, this hematopoiesis in the fetal stage is so named after the liver. And the liver in medicine language is called hepat. And therefore hematopoiesis occurring in the liver is called hepatic hemopoiesis. So even though the spleen also produces blood cells, but much of the blood is coming from the liver, and a lesser amount is coming from the spleen. So we name the stage or this phase after the liver, and that is called hepatic hemopoiesis. And technically this will happen from the 3rd month to the 5th month of gestation. The 3rd to the 5th month of gestation. So that is the fetal stage. So we have spoken about the mesoblastic phase, which occurs within the first 2 months of gestation. We spoke about the fetal hematopoiesis or the hepatic hematopoiesis, which is occurring within the 3rd to the 5th month of gestation. Now, from the 6th month onwards, as the child is developing, during the 6th month, then the bones of the child begins to appear. The fetus now begins to develop what? Bones. And as the fetus begins to develop what? Bones, these bones contain a marrow. We call it the red bone marrow. And this red bone marrow will contribute to the production of blood cells. This implies that stem cells that were present in the liver and in the spleen, there is also going to be the migration of stem cells from the liver or the spleen, or stem cells will seed the bone marrow. So stem cells will move into the bone marrow. That is not to say that the liver and the spleen will have stopped their hematopoietic role or function. So within the 6th month onwards of the fetal life, the bones begins to form, and within the bone we have a bone marrow, and this bone marrow is actually of the red type, and that is of the red type. So there are actually 2 types of bone marrow. We have the red bone marrow and the yellow bone marrow. So within the 6th month onwards, the 6th month, the 7th month, the 8th and the 9th month, the bones of the child, the fetus begins to form, and hematopoiesis begins in the bone marrow. In fact, much of the blood cells will be coming from what? The bone marrow, specifically the red bone marrow. What makes the bone marrow red at this stage is because of the higher concentration of hematopoietic stem cells. Hematopoietic stem cells are actually red, and that explains why the bone marrow, the red bone marrow, is what? Red. And so we looked at, so the bone marrow, bone is actually called mile in the language of medicine. The bone is called the myeloid. And so this phase of hematopoiesis is called the myeloid hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. So we have actually described 3 phases of blood cell production, and these phases include the mesoblastic phase, which is the production of blood cells in the embryo. Then we look at the hepatic phase, which is actually within the fetal stage, which is the production of blood cells from the liver. Then we have looked at the production of blood cells within the bone marrow, and that is called the myeloid hemopoiesis. So we also looked at the various hemoglobins that are produced at these 3 phases. And when we look at the first phase, the mesoblastic phase, which is also known as the embryonic phase. Within the embryo, there are actually hemoglobin molecules that are being produced. And these hemoglobin molecules are embryonic hemoglobins. And technically, these hemoglobin molecules are produced by genes. And generally, there are 6 structural globin genes. And these 6 structural globin genes, these 6 globin genes actually code for 6 globin chains. So there are 6, and we have 6 globin chains. And these 6 globin genes are actually located in 2 separate chromosomes. Remember that genes are located in chromosomes. And so the 6 globin genes, they are located in 2 separate chromosomes. The first chromosome is chromosome cysteine. So we have chromosome cysteine. So in the chromosome cysteine, the genes that we find in chromosome cysteine are zeta, and then the zeta or the alpha globin genes. And we have chromosome 11. And within the chromosome 11 are genes. We have the epsilon gene, we have the gamma gene, So we have epsilon, gamma, we have delta, and then beta. So 2 are located on chromosome 16, 4 are located on chromosome 11. And that makes up a total of 6 globin genes, and each of these globin genes will code for the production of 6 globin what chains. So as the development progresses or hematopoiesis is occurring within the embryo and hemoglobin synthesis is occurring, the hemoglobin is formulated through the combination of globin chains from chromosome 16 and globin chains from chromosome 11. Now, the globin chains from chromosome 16 are also known as the alpha-like globins. So those on chromosome 16 are called the alpha-like globins, and those coming from chromosome 11 are called the beta-like globins. So there is a combination between the alpha-like globulins and the beta-like globulins, and the combination is actually 2 globin chains from the alpha-like globin chains and 2 beta-like globin chains on chromosome 11. So going by this approach, we can have the zeta. So the zeta globin, so we have the first one, zeta, 2 of them, so usually it's 2. So 2 zeta chains will combine with, so we have 2 zeta chains. So let me take zeta. So 2 zeta chains that will combine with epsilon, zeta and epsilon, and that will give me 2 epsilon chains. And this is called hemoglobin GOA 1. And we can have the alpha chain combining with the same epsilon, so 2 alpha chains as against 2 epsilon chains, and this gives us hemoglobin GOA 2. Then we can have zeta combining with gamma, and that will give us the third hemoglobin, 2 zeta chains, then 2 gamma chains, and this is called hemoglobin Portland. Hemoglobin Portland 1. So these are the 3 major embryonic hemoglobins. We have hemoglobin GOA 1, GOA 2, and hemoglobin Portland 1. Then we came to the fetal stage of hematopoiesis, and we established the hemoglobins that are found in the fetal stage of hematopoiesis. And we said that technically in the fetal stage there is a switch of hemoglobin, there is a switch of the embryonic hemoglobins to the fetal hemoglobin. So there is a switch of embryonic hemoglobins, a switch of embryonic hemoglobins, a switch of embryonic hemoglobins to fetal hemoglobins. This means that this fetal hemoglobin, embryonic hemoglobin, GOA 1, GOA 2, hemoglobin Portland, there will be a switch. And this zeta and the zeta chains will technically switch to an alpha chain, and the epsilon will switch to a gamma chain. So the zeta chains will switch to alpha, and the epsilon chain will switch to gamma. So if zeta switches to alpha, then here we will have two alpha chains. Epsilon is switching to gamma. So two alpha chains, two gamma chains. And two alpha chains, two gamma chains is called hemoglobin F. So we'll get hemoglobin F, which is made up of two alpha chains, two beta chains. In all of them, we'll get hemoglobin F. Epsilon will switch to gamma. So we get two alpha chains, two gamma chains. The zeta here will switch to alpha and the gamma will still remain. So we get two alpha chains, two gamma chains. So this means that there is going to be only one type of hemoglobin that we'll be getting in the fetal stage, and that hemoglobin is made up of two alpha chains and two gamma chains. And the hemoglobin molecule that is made up of two alpha chains and two gamma chains, two alpha chains and two gamma chains, is called the hemoglobin what? F. So the most predominant hemoglobin in the fetus is the hemoglobin what? F. As the fetus is maturing or undergoing development, then this hemoglobin F, the gamma chain actually gives way, or the gamma chain begins to switch. So the gamma begins to switch to the beta globin chains. This is when the child is getting to the end of gestation. So if gamma is replaced, if gamma is replaced by beta, then we will get two alpha chains, then two beta chains. And two alpha chains, two beta chains is called hemoglobin A. A stands for adult, F stands for fetus or fetal. So when there is a switch of the gamma chains to the beta chains at the late stages of the fetal life, we will form hemoglobin what? A. But the switch is actually minimal. So the fetal stage actually has a greater percentage of hemoglobin F. When now the fetus comes out from the uterine, now we have what we called neonate. Neonate means newborn. Neonate or newborn, or we are talking about the postnatal life. So at the postnatal life, post means after, nat means birth, neo means new, nat means birth, so new birth, or the same thing as newborn or postnatal. So in the postnatal, now the fetus is now out from the uterus and is now in the outside environment. So the inside environment, which is the intrauterine, the fetus is now out. When the fetus is now out, we call the fetus newborn, neonate. So the hemoglobin that is now becoming more prominent in the postnatal life of the newborn usually is the hemoglobin A, and this will usually happen within the 3rd to the 6th month of the postnatal life of the newborn. So from the 3rd to the 6th month of the postnatal life of what the newborn, we begin to have more of the hemoglobin what? A, and a lesser amount of hemoglobin what? F, and hemoglobin A2. So there is also a switch. There is also a switch of the gamma to delta. So we have delta chains. So when there is a switch, that means that we can have two alpha chains if gamma is switching to delta. So we have two delta chains, and that will give me hemoglobin A2. So hemoglobin A2 comprises of 2 alpha chains and 2 delta chains. The embryonic hemoglobins, I mean the GOA1, GOA2 and hemoglobin Portland, as well as the fetal hemoglobin, I mean hemoglobin F, they are high affinity hemoglobin molecules. They have a higher affinity for oxygen. And the reason why these hemoglobin have a higher affinity for oxygen is because the intrauterine where the fetus is lying, or the embryo, the intrauterine has less oxygen. In other words, there is hypoxia in the intrauterine. And therefore, we need a hemoglobin that has a higher affinity for oxygen to bind to the oxygen and hold fast onto the oxygen, so that oxygen can always be available in the environment where the fetus or the embryo is. But once the fetus comes out as a newborn, then the fetus is no longer in the uterus, but is now in the outside environment, and this is called the extrauterine environment. The extrauterine environment, that is, the baby has now come to the earth. So this newborn is now in an environment saturated or rich in oxygen. So oxygen is rich in the environment, and therefore we do not need a higher affinity hemoglobin molecules. We need a lower or a lesser affinity, lesser oxygen affinity hemoglobin molecules. And those lesser affinity hemoglobin molecules are hemoglobin A, hemoglobin A2. And that explains why the postnatal life of the fetus or of the newborn, the hemoglobin molecules that are produced during the hematopoiesis is mainly hemoglobin A, hemoglobin A2, and a lesser percentage or a small percentage of hemoglobin what? F. Then we also spoke about the hematopoiesis occurring inside the bone marrow and hematopoiesis occurring outside the bone marrow. Hematopoiesis occurring outside the bone marrow is called the extramedullary hematopoiesis. So we spoke about the extramedullary hematopoiesis, meaning hematopoiesis occurring outside the bone marrow, and that is the liver and the spleen. And we also discussed about hematopoiesis occurring inside the bone marrow, and inside means intra, so intramedullary hematopoiesis. So intramedullary hemopoiesis, and that is hematopoiesis occurring within the bone marrow, which is also known as the medullary hematopoiesis.